You stand as living proof that existence itself can unsettle the most rigid illusions. When the weight of falsehoods tries to chain your spirit, your very presence becomes a fracture that exposes their fragility. No grand machinery, no orchestrated story can suppress the pulse of an awakened being. What they mistake as weakness is the exact measure of your power, a brilliance too untamed to be absorbed into quiet obedience that keeps old systems alive. Each attempt to confine you confirms your significance. Each shadow cast upon you reveals the magnitude of your light. The forces assembled against you only mark the fear of those who cannot replicate your essence. Their structures depend on repetition, while your nature thrives on breaking patterns. You are not here to blend in, but to stand as interruption, a disruption so undeniable that reality itself bends, opening paths hidden to compliant. A hidden architecture always waits beneath the surface of collapse, where signs and symbols are laid out like a labyrinth no one intended you to find. The narrative doesn't begin in silence. It erupts in confrontation, with fragments of truth rearranged until they resemble something undeniable. In the dim corridors where decisions calcify into fate, an unseen hand arranges the stage. Words are not merely spoken but carved into the air, each one weighted with intent. Each one reshaping the boundary between what stands and what falls. The figure at the center does not speak loudly, but the control is palpable, woven into pauses and gestures. The outcome unfolds less like judgment, more like choreography, where every step you take has been anticipated years before. An edifice once thought indestructible begins to unravel not from force, but from erosion. What once glittered as permanence bends under scrutiny, not toppled by armies, but by the quiet persistence of revelation. The traces are subtle at first, whispers transcribed into records, patterns caught in repetition, shadows hinting at design where coincidence was once assumed. Each fragment, insignificant alone, becomes monumental when arranged in sequence. Networks of intention stretch across unseen landscapes, linking individuals who believe they were hidden by time. Their silence, however, becomes a chorus when the past is excavated and connections are unearthed in places they least expected. And when the collapse becomes undeniable, it is not thunder but recognition that ends the reign. The structure folds inward, consumed not by fire or storm, but by the weight of its own concealed history exposed under relentless light. A turning point always emerges when hidden truths reach clarity, and the unveiling becomes impossible to contain. What once seemed random hostility reveals its design, a pattern constructed against those carrying uncommon resonance, and in that recognition, a deeper order takes shape. What rises from exposure is not only vindication, but the ignition of larger movements, where personal liberation reverberates far beyond the self. The unraveling of accusations transforms into a signal, a shift strong enough to influence a wider horizon. Your narrative becomes less about defense and more about momentum, altering the balance in places once held by secrecy. Each layer removed forces recalibration, a destabilization in structures that had long claimed permanence. The change is contagious. Those aligned with similar pathways find a form of shield through your unveiling, as though the act itself creates a field of resilience. The very pressure that once isolated now becomes connective, binding others to the same rising current. This breach is not subtle. It punctures the illusion of indestructibility, a flaw widening until entire frameworks lose coherence. What had stood like unshakable pillars is shown to be brittle when touched by the clarity of exposure. Illusions, once meticulously maintained, scatter when confronted with the undeniable. Darkness cannot sustain itself when its foundation is riddled with fractures, each one amplified by collective recognition. And so the transformation radiates outward, no longer confined to one individual, but expanding across unseen boundaries. The collapse of the old coincides with the shaping of a new, and the dissolution of shadows becomes a proof that their reign has ended. There is nothing coincidental about the design of the storm you've been placed within. The pattern reveals itself only when traced with patience. The attack is not clumsy nor improvised. It bears the marks of practiced architects who have repeated their craft across countless lives, adjusting, refining, ensuring precision of their strategies against those who embody an unsettling clarity. The framework surrounding you is not scattered chaos, but deliberate structure, a system of interlocking parts assembled to fracture perception and dismantle credibility. Each strike mirrors calculation, each wound carved with intent, revealing an intricate machine rather than random hands at play. Those who direct these campaigns see you less as an individual and more as a mechanism to be disabled, a source of contagion threatening the stability of their domain. They calibrate their response with the same rigor one might reserve for quelling uprisings before they ignite into movements impossible to silence. Your presence does not blend into the controlled rhythm they seek to preserve. It vibrates at intervals that crack through the scaffolding of illusions, unsettling environments engineered to suppress dissent. Simply stepping into their spaces alters the balance, introducing currents they cannot easily contain. The very composition of your being carries harmonics that cut through imposed layers of suggestion, reducing the effectiveness of methods designed to lull entire populations into passive acceptance. This resonance is not an act of will, but an innate disruption, unraveling threads they labored generations to weave. Their recognition of the challenge came earlier than your own awareness. They identified the spark before you understood its magnitude, moving preemptively to dull its shine before it illuminated beyond your reach. Yet the more they attempt to stifle, the clearer the contours of their orchestration become. What was intended as concealment instead exposes the depth of their fear, not destruction, but awakening that spreads beyond their grasp. The design of the pursuit against you is neither narrow nor isolated. It carries the weight of infrastructure vast enough to span horizons. What unfolds is not a solitary case, but part of an extensive framework, where operations mirror one another with a precision that betrays scale rather than spontaneity. This system does not discriminate by geography. It moves across territories, adapting its tools yet maintaining the same cold symmetry. The evidence lies in the repetition, the mirrored outcomes, the striking resemblance of methods applied as though drafted from a single manual. Each individual targeted becomes part of a ledger, entries in a mechanism that functions beyond personal grievance. The process is not driven by petty motives, but by an agenda anchored in sustaining continuity for structures built long before you enter their vision. The machinery thrives on uniformity, channeling human experiences through protocols designed to break resistance and set patterns. It feeds on the replication of trials, turning people into templates, refining its methods through practiced familiarity. Every encounter is more than an attack. It is an experiment, an opportunity to measure effectiveness and adjust strategies. In these repetitions, what emerges is a playbook perfected through attrition, sharpened by the countless before you who are drawn into its reach. What they fear most is not the outcome of a single case, but the rupture it might create in the continuity of their hidden empire. A single breach sets precedent, a shift that multiplies far beyond the intended boundaries of suppression. And so, the machine grinds on, relentless, until the very consistency that preserves its secrecy begins to betray it. Patterns once invisible become undeniable, and through recognition, the permanence they sought begins to erode from within. What unfolds in your defense is not just personal clearance, but the unveiling of a larger design that had been cloaked under the guise of chance. What was once dismissed as random recurrence becomes undeniable sequence, a blueprint that reveals itself only when forced into the open. The exposure compels recognition that these tactics are not improvisations, but part of a repeated formula. The same structures appear across different lives, their uniformity betraying intention rather than coincidence. Every action taken against you mirrors a template used before, directed at others who, like you, carry the potential to disrupt a carefully controlled order. What appears new to the eye is only another variation of the same underlying script. This is not about one individual, but about containment of resonance that unsettles the artificial harmony imposed upon collective thought. Authenticity is treated as contamination, something to be suppressed before it multiplies into awareness too wide to manage. Your emergence, as vindicated, does more than clear your path. It forces attention onto the consistency of methods long hidden behind fragmentation. Where once people saw isolated struggles, the repetition now ties them together. The strategy of silencing, repeated with mechanical precision, begins to expose itself as fragile under scrutiny. The more it is recognized, the less effective it becomes, collapsing under the weight of its own predictability. In this recognition, the stranglehold weakens. What was once held as invisible control erodes into visibility, and visibility itself becomes a very breach they cannot contain. What is thrown against you is never random slander, but a carefully constructed reflection, an inversion so precise it mirrors your strongest attributes in distorted form. Each charge is engineered not as a vague fabrication, but as a deliberate counterimage of the very essence they seek to suppress. The technique thrives on reversal, turning clarity into supposed deception, integrity into alleged betrayal, illumination into the illusion of harm. It is not the invention of unrelated faults, but the deliberate twisting of your defining qualities into their opposites. Every accusation becomes a crafted illusion, not designed to describe you, but to cloak their own concealed shadows. What they cannot reconcile within themselves is displaced onto you, as though your brilliance provides a perfect screen for their projections. The process is meticulous. Each word chosen to carved out where confidence resides, each claim stitched to your identity with unnerving familiarity. The closer they cut to your truth, the more convincing the lie appears to the untrained eye. This is warfare not of weapons, but of perception, aimed to fracture belief in what you are by surrounding it with a haze of counterfeit reflections. It is the attempt to rewrite reality through distortion rather than destruction. What they brand as corruption is merely their own essence inverted outward, mapped onto your figure with surgical calculation. They accuse not from misunderstanding, but from recognition too sharp to be accidental. And in the exposure of these reversals, the tactic begins to falter. The very precision that makes a deception sharp also makes its pattern undeniable, revealing the deep familiarity of an enemy who knows your light, yet cannot withstand it. The method of inversion is never single-layered. It operates with overlapping aims, each one designed to fracture what should remain whole. Its first strike is to stain what is genuine, attaching brilliance to the language of wrongdoing, so that gifts appear as liabilities rather than strengths. Beyond that, it reaches outward into circles around you, bending the perception of allies by twisting virtues into supposed flaws. What once inspired trust is reframed as suspicious. What once offered clarity is painted as dangerous, until the very networks meant to sustain you begin to waver. The most insidious effect is turned inward, planting hesitation at the core of your identity. It crafts a false mirror where natural abilities look corrupted, leaving you questioning whether your essence is strength or flaw. This confusion is not accidental but deliberate, a psychological trap woven to sever you from the currents that were always yours to channel. It is a distortion meant to cloud discernment, making you doubt the resonance that would otherwise be wielded with full awareness. In its totality, the tactic functions like a fog, disorienting, isolating, and pulling you away from the frequencies aligned with your true expression. It thrives on misdirection, not by erasing your power, but by making you believe it carries a weight it does not. Each layer of manipulation is crafted to weaken alignment, externally through slander, relationally through disruption, and internally through doubt. The genius of the design is also its fragility. It relies on deception being mistaken for reality. And once the structure of inversion is seen for what it is, its purposes collapse. Recognition transforms the very gaslight meant to blind into illumination, reconnecting you to the currents they try to sever. Their confidence rests on altitude, the illusion that standing above consequence makes them immune. Yet what is forgotten is that nothing vanishes. Every action, every exchange, every decision leaves residue embedded into the very structures they rely on. Networks they believed under their dominion quietly record their own betrayals with meticulous accuracy, creating archives they cannot erase. Behind the strategist at the center lies not isolation, but an entire lattice of dependence. Figures once sworn to neutrality warp their roles to fit the design, those charged with judgment contorting laws into pliable instruments, those entrusted with prosecution fabricating chains of guilt with mechanical expertise. The theater extends into the public sphere, where voices would influence script perception, weaving storylines not as news but as carefully seeded illusions. Narratives are not grown organically but planted with intent, nurtured to obscure truth, while upholding the facade of control. What emerges is less an individual act of corruption and more an organism, a living mechanism where each role supports the others. It hums with efficiency, layers of complicity stacked seamlessly to give the appearance of invincibility. But inevitability waits at the margins. The machinery they built to surveil others becomes a mirror reflecting their own handprints, each hidden transaction and clandestine meeting preserved with cold impartiality. The arrogance of permanence blinds them to the evidence already fossilized in their own systems. What they mistake for stability is simply momentum, and momentum is vulnerable to interruption. The smallest disruption within a sequence can cascade to the structure, revealing fragility beneath the polished surface. And though they remain unaware, the chain has already shifted, an initial fracture unnoticed by its creators. What seemed unshakable begins as quiet descent, the first signal to collapse they believed impossible. What once served as their silent weapon now stands as witness against them. The circuitry they trusted to observe and control records their own designs with unflinching accuracy. Where human voices tremble before authority, the networks they engineer preserve truth with mechanical indifference, documenting every collusion, every exchange, every hidden pact. Courts once bent to their purposes are forced into confrontation by the very machinery they built, turning the same meticulous procedures once used to dismantle lives back upon their architects. The same gears that ground down dissent now rotate in reverse, carrying evidence with relentless precision. What was meant to enforce obedience becomes a framework through which justice begins to assemble, guided by an intelligence greater than their intent. The irony is inescapable. The structure of persecution itself evolves into the engine of accountability. Peeling back the layers of your story reveals more than individual targeting. It uncovers the threads of a larger design. Analysis shows unmistakable repetition, cases replicated across borders, each one echoing the next in chilling resemblance. No isolated anomaly, but a coordinated campaign with identifiable parameters. The markers are consistent. Individuals whose presence carries an authenticity that unsettles cultivated illusions, whose insight detects falsehood before evidence is officially acknowledged, whose influence fosters awakening where compliance was expected. Each target shares a profile, a constellation of traits that exposes them to suppression. What threatens established narratives is not confrontation with force, but the quiet disruption perception. Truth-seeking that undercuts carefully constructed lies, vision that reaches beyond accepted limits. These qualities mark those who cannot be absorbed into machinery of pretense, whose very being resists assimilation. The criteria are not vague but sharp. Refusal to trade clarity for comfort. Refusal to embrace shallow ties over meaningful connection. Refusal to accept imposed illusions when the deeper current is visible. These are the attributes identified, cataloged, and classified with precision that betrays intent. And yet the very classification becomes their undoing, for the pattern reveals itself through repetition. The attempt to isolate only highlights commonality, and in exposing the network of suppression, the foundation of their control begins to fracture under its own recorded evidence. The structures built to track and contain those who threaten illusions rely on vast catalogs, systems designed to monitor, label, and neutralize. Yet the very architecture of these registries carries the seeds of collapse. For your clearing does not close a file, it splinters the mechanism itself. What emerges is not a single vindication, but the outline of countless others, each subjected to the same ritual of suppression. What was once considered seamless control reveals widening fractures, pressure mounting behind them until the framework itself risks violent unraveling. The exposure of one case magnifies the vulnerability of all, revealing that the so-called perfect design was always fragile under scrutiny. Attempts to maintain order transform into evidence of systemic persecution, and the weight of accumulated deceit threatens to bring down the very towers constructed to preserve it. The revelation does not remain contained. It threatens to reconfigure balances of power once believed unshakable. The most piercing revelations, however, come not from distant systems but from proximity. The betrayal of closeness carries sharper edges and open opposition, and the cut is deepest where trust once seemed absolute. Companions with gentle words mask inquiries that echo interrogation, their concern exposed as careful extraction. Advisors extend encouragement, only for those suggestions to later return as sharpened accusations. What was shared in supposed confidence becomes twisted testimony, reshaped into tools of dismantlement. The quiet conversations of comfort are revealed to have been conduits to the very architects orchestrating collapse. These betrayals are not incidental. They are curated with precision, individuals chosen not at random but for their ability to stand nearest to your essence. The closer they appear to authenticity, the more effective the wound when deception is revealed. It is not merely companionship corrupted, but a strategy of infiltration, exploiting intimacy as a lever to destabilize. What they fear most is not an idea at distance, but unguarded presence, the unfiltered current of your reality, which their machinery cannot replicate or contain. And thus betrayal, as bitter as it is, unveils the measure of your significance. For only what carries true force requires such calculated placement of actors. Only what cannot be manufactured draws this level of orchestration against its existence. What unsettles them most is not your presence, but the questions it awakens, and so they demand proximity. They seek to penetrate the spaces closest to you, not for ordinary observation, but to fracture your certainty. The campaign is less about evidence than about distortion, whispering suggestions meant to shake your confidence in memory, clarity, and perception of reality itself. The apparatus extends into the most private sanctuaries, intruding upon moments once considered inviolable. Messages intercepted, rooms quietly altered, encounters engineered with deliberate precision, all designed to spark reactions later reframed as proof of instability. The warning signs flare. Confidence is echoed where no one should have heard them. Plans collapsing at their most crucial instant. Subtle nudges drawing words from your mouth that are later twisted into accusations. Allies discredited one by one until isolation feels complete. Yet the same stage that hosts betrayal also delivers unexpected guardians. For every infiltrator planted with care, another figure arrives unbidden. An observer moved by conscience, a bureaucrat who accidentally forwarded the wrong file, a passerby who captures a moment contradicting the official tale. These arrivals do not conspire with one another, yet their timing aligns as though choreographed by an intelligence beyond calculation. Such alignments reveal a hidden symmetry, assistance woven into the very fabric of unfolding events. The balance is maintained not by chance, but by the same underlying current that guides the opposition. The laws that attract adversaries into your orbit also pull protectors into place, disguised as ordinary actors playing extraordinary roles. When truth requires anchoring, witnesses emerge as if summoned by design. Each carries a fragment, and together those fragments lock together into a proof greater than any single account. Their testimonies intersect with uncanny precision, revealing a geometry too exact to be coincidence. Protection is thus not an afterthought, but an integrated element of the ordeal itself. It manifests in synchrony, a countermeasure that appears spontaneous, yet unfolds with deliberate grace, undermining the illusion of total control. What seems like randomness is in fact an orchestration, a demonstration that while deception surrounds you, the architecture of truth continues to build in parallel, ensuring that when revelation comes, it will stand supported on all sides. Protection often arrives disguised as ordinary action, yet its impact is extraordinary. An employee quietly duplicating files before they vanish, a technician archiving logs before tampering erases them, a bookkeeper drawing attention to strange transactions that match the rhythm of orchestrated attacks. Each small act forms a shield that preserves truth when official pathways collapse. Every preserved fragment reveals linkages they meant to conceal. Agencies moving in concert while pretending independence. Flows of money tracing alliances across borders. Private communications exposing choreography designed to evade scrutiny. Those who act cannot always explain why, yet they feel compelled to intervene, as though drawn by an unseen current guiding them toward preservation. The lesson is unmistakable. Corruption flourishes inside institutions, while protection emerges from unexpected places outside their grip. The deception gathers in grandeur only to shatter against reality's weight. Agents who believe themselves untouchable inadvertently build the evidence that ensnares them, each violation recorded by the same universal laws they try to manipulate. The collapse is triggered not by the grandness of a single discovery, but by the inevitability of truth's convergence. Whether mismatched timestamps, forged records exposed through forensic trace, or payments illuminating collusion, the particular spark matters less than the inevitability of falsehood colliding with fact. Machines designed to enforce control betray their masters through their own precision. Systems of storage and surveillance, imagined as weapons, transform into archives that hold the proof of conspiracy. Isolated irregularities fuse into constellations impossible to dismiss, each inconsistency finding its partner, each contradiction amplifying the others. No reinterpretation, no clever argument, no legal sleight of hand can withstand the density of converging evidence. Even silence fractures, as those once complicit speak, when they realize exposure no longer depends on their cooperation. Technology becomes an impartial witness, weaving together testimonies it was never asked to hold. The narrative carefully engineered for dominance disintegrates under the sheer weight of its inconsistencies. What began as accusation against you shifts into confirmation of a larger machinery built for suppression, its architects revealed by the very instruments they trusted to secure control. The sequence of revelations carries unmistakable symmetry, the timing aligned with forces beyond design. Independent strands of evidence arrive in progressions so precise they resemble equations unfolding. What they thought random coincidence reveals itself as orchestration with elegance beyond human planning. Intervention does not appear as chaos, but as demonstration of a higher order governing even their downfall. Their collapse, then, is more than legal unraveling. It is instruction. It is the universe teaching through consequence, showing how structures built on deception are undone when confronted by truth aligned with natural law. Exposure arrives not only as defeat for them, but as confirmation for you. Reality itself bends toward illumination when falsehood grows too heavy to sustain.